The iron tastes like rust and old salt where it presses against Claudia Severina's mouth, not because she is biting it, but because the collar has been forced so close to her skin that every breath brings the metal into her senses. And in the hypogeum, beneath the Flavan amphitheater, there is no clean air anyway, only damp stone, torch smoke, stale sweat, and the sour stink of fear that has lived in these tunnels longer than any man can remember. Claudia is 26, raised with Greek tutors, trained to speak carefully, to sit with dignity, to represent a family name that once opened every door in Naples, and yet in this underworld, her name is just a note on a wax tablet, a line in a schedule, a condemned body waiting for a date. 6 days ago she was still in a villa overlooking the bay, still wearing silk that caught sunlight like water, still a bride entitled to a house that controlled ships and trade routes, and respectable dinners where death was served with a smile. Now she kneels on wet stone with shackles on her wrists, and the only voices that matter are the ones that echo through corridors built to hide what Rome pretends not to know. Above her, the arena is a promise of cheers and spectacle. Below it, the arena is a machine, and she can hear its gears turning, guards stomping past, keys rattling, animals shifting in cages, men grunting as they train for death with the calm discipline of craftsmen. Somewhere nearby, a woman is whispering prayers so fast they sound like the flutter of trapped birds. And farther down the line, there is a silence that feels worse than crying, the silence of someone who has already left herself behind. Claudia keeps her eyes forward, because she understands that looking frightened feeds the people who control this place, and she has already been stripped of enough. A shadow stops at her cell, blocking what little light slips through the corridor, and when she looks up she sees a man who does not move like a guard or an administrator, but like a weapon that learned to walk. He is broad-shouldered, marked by old scars that have healed, badly handsome in a harsh, broken way that makes beauty feel like a threat rather than comfort, and on his arm a gold band catches torchlight, an emblem of status that should not exist on someone who lives by killing. He studies her the way a merchant studies a horse, and the humiliation burns hotter than the collar. This is the senator's daughter? He asks, not even bothering to lower his voice, as if a title is only a curiosity. A second voice confirms her name and her charge poisoning her husband and the champion. S. mouth curves into something that is not quite a smile. The calendar matters here more than truth. He hears 7 days, the way a man hears time, and in this place time is ownership. Claudia forces herself to meet his eyes, because she will not look away and make herself smaller, even though her stomach twists as if it is trying to escape her body. She demands his name, and the request surprises him like a slap, because condemned prisoners are not supposed to speak as if they are still citizens. Titus Alius Magnus, he says at last, and the corridor seems to narrow around the words. Magnus the Destroyer. 47 fights. No losses. Then he leans closer and speaks with the casual certainty of someone repeating a rule everyone follows. For the next 7 days the arena has assigned her an assignment in the hypogeum is a form of death that begins before the sand ever tastes blood. The guard unlocks the door. Magnus steps inside, filling the small space with heat and shadow, and offers her a choice that is not really a choice, walk or be dragged, because the hypogeum is built to turn dignity into obedience. Claudia stands, choosing the only action that still feels like hers. And as she is led down the corridor, she understands the first terrible truth. The histories Rome likes to write are written for the sunlight above, not for the stone below. No marble inscription will record what happens in these tunnels. No poet will describe the waiting cells, the whispered bargains, the unspoken hierarchies, or the way power here moves like water through cracks, finding every weakness. And as the door to Magnus's quarters closes behind her, she realizes the second truth is worse. Whatever rules govern this man, whatever restraint he may pretend to possess her fate, is still scheduled inked into the games like a line in a script. And the hypogeum does not forget its lines. Night in the hypogeum does not arrive suddenly, but seeps in like ink through water, and as the torches dim and the daytime noise drains away, Claudia Severina begins to understand that this underground city has a different rhythm, one that belongs entirely to power and secrecy rather than law or daylight. From Magnus's quarters she can hear the corridors, breathing stone carrying sound farther than it should, every whisper magnified by fear, and it becomes impossible not to map the place by noise alone. The distant clang of gates sealing, the restless shifting of animals denied sleep to sharpen their fury, the low laughter of men who know they are untouchable in this hour. Magnus had left her alone with clear instructions, not to cross the threshold, not because the door was locked, but because beyond it she would cease to belong to anyone in particular, and in the hypogeum that means belonging to everyone. She sits on the edge of the pallet and listens, and listening teaches her more than questions ever could, because no one here explains anything unless it serves them. She hears a guard bargaining quietly with someone in a neighboring corridor, hears coin change hands, hears a woman's voice rise once in protest, and then cut off so sharply it feels as if the sound itself has been broken. And Claudia understands that schedules exist for executions, not for what happens before them. The arena runs on preparation, and condemned bodies are part of that preparation, used to fill the long hours between arrival and spectacle. During the day, the hypogeum is a workshop, all efficiency and routine. But at night, it becomes an economy, one where access as currency and silence is the highest form of payment. She remembers how Roman law once wrapped her like armor, how her name guaranteed hearings and witnesses, and the slow dignity of process. And she realizes that none of that ever reached this place, because the hypogeum was designed precisely to exist outside the world where those protections mattered. This is where things that embarrass the city are stored until they can be transformed into entertainment, where the condemned are stripped not only of rights, but of narrative, reduced to functions rather than people. Magnus's restraint, whatever its source, feels suddenly fragile against this background and anomaly. That depends entirely on his continued interest and status. And Claudia understands that survival here is not about virtue or innocence, but about learning how to move within a system that rewards forgetting. She studies the quarters again, the books, the writing tools, the objects of a private life, carved out in a place meant to erase individuality. And she begins to see Magnus less as a singular threat, and more as a node in a larger structure, someone shaped by this world even as he benefits from it. He is both privileged and trapped, granted comforts that mask the truth that his value exists only as long as he can perform violence on command, and that realization changes how she frames him in her mind. The sounds continue through the walls, some unmistakable even when muted by stone, and Claudia forces herself not to imagine details, because imagination here is another way to be consumed. Instead, she focuses on patterns, on who moves, when on which voices recur, and which vanish, and she begins to grasp the hidden hierarchies that rule the night. Champions over common fighters, fighters over guards, guards over prisoners, and above all the administrators whose absence is their greatest power. By the time sleep finally claims her in short, shallow fragments, Claudia knows one thing with cold clarity. Mercy in the hypogeum is not kindness, it is leverage, and if she is to last the remaining days before the games, she must understand exactly why. Magnus chose to pause the machinery for her, because whatever that reason is, it will determine whether she remains an exception or is quietly returned to the current that pulls everyone else under. By the third day, Claudia Severina understands that the hypogeum survives on rules that are never spoken aloud, rules learned through watching who is obeyed without question and who is ignored even when they shout. And this knowledge settles into her mind with the slow certainty of something dangerous. Magnus returns from training each evening, marked by new bruises and the familiar calm of a man who has rehearsed death so often it no longer surprises him, and their conversations grow longer, not kinder, but more precise, circling truths neither of them state directly. He speaks of the arena as if it were a god that demands offerings, rather than a building filled with men. And she listens carefully, because every metaphor reveals how deeply this place has rewritten him. He explains, almost casually, that champions are rewarded not just with food and space, but with discretion, that their quarters are respected, because administrators prefer not to see what keeps their most valuable assets compliant. And Claudia recognizes the logic immediately. Power here is maintained by deliberate blindness. What is not recorded does not exist, and what does not exist cannot threaten the stories Rome tells itself about honor and spectacle. As he talks, she notices how often he refers to what is expected rather than what is ordered, and in that distinction she sees the true architecture of control, a system where obedience is produced by habit rather than force. When she asks him why he reads philosophers who teach acceptance of fate, he pauses longer than usual before answering, admitting that men who kill for a living need some language to explain to themselves why they still deserve to exist, and the admission cracks something open between them, not trust, but recognition. Claudia begins to test the edges of her confinement in careful ways, asking about the schedules, about which corridors are sealed and which are merely watched, about how names move through the hypogeum faster than bodies, and down. Magnus answers selectively, perhaps without realizing that every answer is a thread she is collecting. He tells her that condemned women are categorized quietly, not by innocence or guilt, but by usefulness, that some are marked for immediate display, while others are held back to satisfy private claims, and that this sorting happens before any execution is announced, which is why trials like hers are rushed, because delay complicates logistics. The realization chills her more than the stone ever could. Her condemnation was not just convenient, it was necessary. That night, when Magnus sleeps, she moves through the room with practiced care and opens the drawer she has memorized, retrieving the small iron key she discovered earlier, feeling its weight as if it were a question. She does not know what it opens, only that Magnus hid it for a reason, and in the hypogeum hidden things are always dangerous. The key fits a narrow door she had assumed was storage, and when it turns the lock, the hinge opens onto a space that smells of old wax and dust rather than bodies, a place meant to be forgotten. Inside she finds tablets and rolls marked with symbols rather than names lists that record transfers, privileges, favors granted off the books. And she understands that this is the shadow ledger of the arena, the proof that access to the condemned is not chaos, but policy disguised as indulgence. She does not grid everything, only enough to grasp the scale of it, enough to see familiar family names reduced to codes, enough to know that her own presence here is part of a pattern rather than an accident. When she closes the door and returns the key, her hands are steady not because she is unafraid, but because fear has finally sharpened into purpose. By morning, she knows that survival will not come from appealing to Magnus's restraint alone, because restraint is fragile, in a system built to reward forgetting, and as footsteps echo down the corridor signaling the start of another day, she understands that the arena's greatest secret is not what it does to bodies, but how carefully it trains everyone involved to pretend those bodies never mattered at all. The approach of the Ludi Romani changes the hypogeum in subtle but unmistakable ways, like the tightening of a net that everyone can feel but no one names, and Claudia. Severina senses the shift before Magnus mentions it, because the corridors grow busier while the rules grow quieter. Administrators begin appearing more frequently their sandals, clean their voices calm, carrying tablets that decide who will rise through trapdoors and who will not return at all, and priests follow them murmuring blessings that sound less like prayers and more like rehearsals for absolution. The arena above is being dressed for celebration, but below it the machinery accelerates, and condemned prisoners start disappearing from cells days ahead of schedule, removed for reasons that are never announced and therefore never questioned. Claudia hears the change in the night sounds, fewer voices pleading, more silence, the kind that settles after something irreversible has already happened, and she understands that proximity to the games increases everyone's appetite for efficiency. Magnus becomes more guarded, his patience thinner, not cruel but stretched. Because champions are valuable during festival weeks, and valuable assets are monitored more closely. He warns her not to speak to anyone if she hears footsteps outside the quarters, not because she might reveal herself, but because any reminder that she exists invites questions, and questions invite records. She realizes then that her safety has depended on being inconvenient to notice, and as the festival approaches, inconvenience is being eliminated everywhere. When an official finally does notice her, it is done politely, with a voice trained to sound reasonable, and the politeness is more frightening than threats. The man explains that there has been a discrepancy in the execution schedule, that her name has appeared twice in different lists, once as public spectacle and once as private disposition, and that such errors must be resolved before the games begin, because confusion undermines confidence. Claudia understands immediately what he is offering without him saying it directly. Clarity in exchange for cooperation, silence in exchange for a smoother death. He suggests that a brief public confession would simplify matters, confirm the narrative Rome prefers, and allow her execution to proceed cleanly on the sand, rather than in some corridor that history will never acknowledge. If she refuses, he implies, the arena will resolve the discrepancy another way, by substituting a different body for her public role, someone less complicated, someone whose absence will not raise questions. The cruelty of the choice is precise, designed to force her into complicity, and as the official speaks, Claudia sees how the system protects itself by turning victims into participants. Magnus listens without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when the man leaves, the space feels smaller than before, as if the walls themselves are leaning in. Claudia tells Magnus what she found in the sealed room, not everything but enough to make the shape of the secret clear, and for the first time she sees genuine fear flicker across his features, not fear of punishment, but fear of exposure. He admits that champions are permitted to forget certain things as long as they never try to remember them all at once, and that the ledger she saw is the boundary between tolerated excess and scandal that would force Rome to look at itself. As night falls, the hypogeum fills with ritual. Guards making offerings to household gods, priests rehearsing lines, gladiators sharpening blades with the focus of men who know the crowd will demand perfection. And Claudia realizes that her existence has become an administrative problem rather than a moral one. When distant horns announce the final preparations above, Magnus tells her to rest. But rest is impossible, because she understands that the next decision she makes will not only determine how she dies, but whether the arena continues to pretend that what happens beneath its floor is nothing more than shadow and stone. By the fifth day, the hypogeum feels compressed, as if the weight of the approaching festival has pushed the stone inward, and Claudia Severina moves through the hours with the careful focus of someone walking along the edge of a blade. Magnus is summoned repeatedly by officials who speak to him with smiles that never reach their eyes, reminding him of his value, his upcoming bout, the expectations placed upon a champion during the Ludi Romani, and Claudia recognizes the pressure for what it is: a tightening leash disguised as honor. Champions are not punished openly. They are corrected through reminders of what can be withdrawn, privileges revoked, silences broken. When Magnus returns from one such meeting, his mood is darker, his movements sharper, and he finally tells her what the arena wants from him in exchange for continuing to ignore her presence. They want a display not of skill, but of compliance, a gesture that proves he remains aligned with the customs. Everyone pretends not to see, because a champion who refuses the unspoken rewards risks becoming a symbol, and symbols are dangerous. Claudia understands that his restraint has already drawn attention, and attention is lethal here, because it invites scrutiny of arrangements that depend on remaining informal. She offers him what she has, instead not pleading, not bargaining with her body, but laying out the consequences as she now sees them, explaining that the ledger proves the arena's excesses are not isolated acts, but a system that connects administrators, patrons, and families who believe themselves untouchable. Magnus listens, and in his silence she senses calculation rather than indifference. The weighing of risks by a man who has survived 15 years, by understanding when to strike and when to endure. He tells her that exposing the ledger openly would destroy her instantly, and likely him as well, because Rome does not punish quietly when confronted publicly, it erases. But he also admits that knowledge is leverage, even when it cannot be spoken aloud, that there are moments when a whisper placed correctly can shift outcomes without ever becoming a shout. The hypogeum, he says, runs on reputation as much as fear, and certain names cannot afford even a suggestion of scandal during the games. As night deepens, the sounds outside grow more chaotic, drunken laughter mixing with ritual chants, and Claudia realizes the festival has already begun below the sand, long before the crowd gathers above. She hears guards arguing over access, hears a fight break out and end quickly, hears the unmistakable rhythm of cruelty continuing uninterrupted, and the awareness hardens her resolve. When a pair of guards arrive earlier than expected, claiming she is needed for reassignment, Magnus understands immediately that the arena has decided to remove uncertainty by acting ahead of schedule. He blocks the doorway with his body, using his status like a shield, and demands written orders, knowing delays are his last weapon. The guards hesitate, not because they respect Claudia, but because they fear the administrative consequences of crossing a champion without documentation. And in that hesitation, Claudia sees the opening she has been waiting for. She slips the key into Magnus's hand, tells him which names are marked in the ledger, which codes correspond to which families, and watches his expression change as the implications settle. This is not rescue. She knows that now. Not salvation or justice, but disruption. A chance to force the arena to choose between silence and exposure. As the guards retreat to fetch authorization, Magnus turns to her and tells her that whatever happens next will not stop her execution, because the games require a body, but it may change which body and how publicly. Claudia accepts this without protest, because she has reached the point where survival is no longer her only measure of success. When the corridor fills again with footsteps and raised voices, she straightens her shoulders, understanding that the final act is approaching, and that the arena, for the first time since she arrived, has been forced to account for her as more than a convenient disappearance. The final day arrives without ceremony in the hypogeum, because endings here are never announced. They are processed, and Claudia Severina wakes to a stillness that feels heavier than any chain she has worn. The corridors outside Magnus's quarters are quieter than she has ever heard them, not empty, but controlled, as if the entire underground city is holding its breath, while decisions made elsewhere settle into place. Magnus returns early armor already strapped to his shoulders, his face set in a calm expression. He wears before entering the arena, and he tells her that the ledger did its work without ever being seen, that certain names reacted exactly as expected when the possibility of exposure was introduced, and that the administrators chose the only solution that preserved their illusion of order. There will be a death on the sand. There must always be one, but it will not unfold exactly as scheduled, and not everyone who intended to watch from the safety of the stands will be comfortable doing so. Claudia understands immediately what that means. The arena has decided to trade certainty for containment, to redirect the consequences rather than eliminate them, and in that decision, she recognizes Rome's true genius, not for justice, but for survival. She is given water-clean cloth and a moment to stand upright without shackles, small mercies that feel more like acknowledgments than kindness. And as guards escort her through the tunnels, she notices how carefully they avoid her eyes, how procedure replaces cruelty when responsibility becomes diffuse. Above her, the crowd roars as the games begin, unaware that the spectacle they cheer has already consumed lives before the first sword is raised, unaware that the arena's greatest violence is administrative rather than theatrical. Claudia is brought to a holding chamber closer to the sand, where light filters down through grates and pale ribbons, and there she waits, not for rescue, but for conclusion. Magnus does not come to her again, because champions are visible during festivals. And visibility is dangerous when arrangements are being quietly altered, but she knows he is fighting, because the roar of the crowd changes when he enters, swelling with the familiar hunger for dominance. In that sound, she hears the truth of Rome more clearly than any philosophy. The city does not require belief, only participation. When her moment arrives, it does so without drama. A guard speaking her name as if reading inventory, and Claudia walks forward with the composure that once impressed dinner guests and now unsettles men who expect pleading. What happens next is not recorded in the histories, not because it lacked significance, but because it complicated the story Rome prefers to tell about itself, and complications are erased more thoroughly than failures. The crowd sees what it expects to see: a condemned woman fulfilling a sentence that confirms the righteousness of the law, while beneath that image another truth settles into place, one where decisions made in darkness ripple outward without ever being acknowledged. Claudia's final understanding is not of cruelty, because that she learned quickly, but of complicity, of how entire civilizations are built on agreements to look away, to enjoy the spectacle without asking what made it possible. Long after the sand is cleaned and the games remembered as triumphs of skill and tradition, the hypogeum continues its work, absorbing bodies and stories alike, and Rome endures not because it was innocent, but because it learned how to forget.